All right, let's take a look at the ideas behind population dynamics. So population ecology, this is another branch of ecology where we look at how populations change. And population, remember, means a group of individuals of a species that live in a particular area. And several attributes help predict population dynamics. By dynamics, we mean changes in population. So we look at population size, density, distribution, sex ratio, and age structure, and also birth and death rates. So population size just means the number of individuals present at a given time. And here we see the passenger pigeon, which was once North America's most numerous bird, but is now extinct. And they used to have 240-mile-long flocks. So imagine a flock that long and even a mile wide. It could even darken the sky. And they went extinct in the early 1900s. And so here we see a picture of that. And population density means the number of individuals per unit area. And so that would be, so here we see a picture from the 1800s, and we see super high population density as they are darkening the sky here. By population distribution, we mean the spatial arrangement of individuals. And here we can see like a random distribution with trees. Here we see a clumped distribution, and this could be because of needing to have a certain habitat, or just for protection because the predators can only go after the ones on the outside, or for mating purposes. Maybe they're trying to intermingle as much as possible. And then you also have a uniform distribution, which is often seen with animals who are territorial or have certain nutrient requirements, where if they get too close, they each don't get enough nutrients. This is an age structure diagram, and we're going to do a lot more with this in our next unit. But age distribution is what it's also called, and it means the relative numbers of individuals of each age or age class in a population. And age structure diagrams show this information. And you can see here age on the vertical axis, and it goes in 5-year increments. So we can see by looking at this particular diagram that we have more people of the ages 0 through 15 than we do up here at ages 80 through 90. And we look at these three different colors because the orange or the red is pre-reproductive age, so before puberty. And then you get your reproductive age, which goes from your mid-teens all the way up until your mid-40s. And then you have your post-reproductive age. And some countries have some pretty unusually shaped age structure diagrams because they might have a big drop in the number of births in their country, or there may have been, in our case, like a baby boom, which happened after soldiers came back from World War II, and so we have a lot of people in our society right now in the U.S. who are in the age bracket of 60 to 80 years old. So here's some 4 classic shapes, and we'll do more with this. But this shape would indicate that the population is increasing rapidly because you have a lot of new babies born here. This would indicate increasing slowly, so it's not as extreme as the one before it. And this is stable because it's starting to look more like a column, so you have equal representation at each age bracket. And this would suggest a population that's decreasing in size because you have more old people and fewer young people. And so here's a summary. More young equals population growing. More old equals population declining. We also look at the sex ratio. How many males for female? This is the ratio of males to females in the population. Even ratios near 50-50 are most common. Fewer females causes slower population growth, since we're limited by how often females can produce babies. And now let's take a look at exponential growth. Now, this is called an exponential curve, or also called a J curve sometimes. We have population growth rate on the left side and years after initial colonization. So this is actual data taken from the Scottish pine in an area where primary succession had occurred, and actually it was secondary succession. The vegetation was wiped out, but the soil remained. So they looked to see how quickly the Scottish pine came back. And by exponential growth, it has a very specific meaning. It means when a population increases by the same percentage each year. And let's take a look at an example with money. So Again, unregulated populations increase by exponential growth, similar to money growing in a savings account. So let's say that you start with $1,000 in your account at birth, and if that account earns 5% annual compound interest, that means that at the end of that first year, you're going to have $1,000 plus 5% of that $1,000, giving you a total of $1,050. After 10 years, it would grow to this amount. After 20 years, this amount. And you can see that by the time you're 80, that 1,000 would have become almost $50,000. And there's something called the rule of 70. The rule of 70 is a quick way to calculate how long it will take a population to double if we know its growth rate. And to use it, we just divide the number 70 by the percentage growth rate. And this will tell you the number of years it will take to double. So let's take an example 1. If Whoville maintains its percentage growth rate of 5%, how long will it take for its population to double? And by the way, if you want to go through and learn the math about why it's 70 and not rule of 65 or something like that, we can do that in class tomorrow. So it's really pretty basic. We're going to do 70 divided by 5, which is 14 years. So if you put your money into a bank account that gets 5% interest rate, it would double after 14 years. Example 2, you deposit $1,000 in a bank that pays you 3% annual interest rate. How many years for it to double? So 70 divided by 3, whatever that number is. Okay, let's do a little practice problem here. A population of invasive frog species in a lake is growing at an exponential rate of 8% annually. The initial population introduced had 200 individuals. What will the frog population be after 1 year and after 2 years? So this is similar to one of the questions that I gave you in assignment 3.4. And so let's say year 0. So let's go year 0, 1, and 2. And over here, population size. So we're going to start with 200. After 1 year, this is going to be 200 plus 8% of 200. And we can show that by doing 0.08 times 200. And that's going to be 200 plus 0.08 times 200 is going to be 16. So that equals 216. Now, after another year, it's going to be 216 plus 8% added on. So 8% of 216. And I'm going to have to pull the calculator out here. Plus 17.3. And so that will give us a total of 233 and a third frog. So this is the way exponential growth works. We can see that in the first year we added 16 frogs, and in the second year we added 17.3. And that's why we end up getting not a straight line for a curve, but a J curve. Okay, let's go to another question. If it maintains its growth rate, how long will it take for the frog population to double? Alright, so rule of 70, I'm going to let you do it on your own. So pause the video for a moment now and figure out what it would be. Alright, if you got 8.75 years to double, that is correct. So, interesting fact about exponential growth. A single bacteria cell, given all the food and space it needs, could divide into a ball of cells the size of the Earth in 24 hours. So, that's pretty amazing. But we're going to see that it won't happen because bacteria don't have all the food and space that they need. They encounter some kind of restrictions or limiting factors. And in this case, a bacterium dividing represents a growth rate of 100% because you're getting a whole new cell in addition to the original. That's just kind of an FYI. So logistic growth curve. If there was nothing trying to slow down its growth, then we would see this going like that. However, because of other factors, limiting factors like water, space, food, predators, and disease, the growth will slow down until you end up with some stable population size. And that stable population size that it can achieve when growing as much as possible with those limiting factors is called the carrying capacity. Alright, so that's a term you need to know here. This is how big the population can get when the limiting factors slow down its rate of growth. So what are some limits on growth? Limiting factors restrain exponential population growth, slowing the growth rate down. We already said water, space, food predators, disease, etc. The population growth levels off at a carrying capacity, the maximum population size of a given species and environment can sustain. Initial exponential growth, slowing and stabilizing at carrying capacity, is shown by a logistic growth curve. That's the name we get for this. And logistic growth curve because you're throwing in these other factors here that are keeping it from growing forever or exponentially. Alright, so we actually see this when we have yeast growing in a test tube, for example, in a laboratory. The yeast population grows exponentially, but then they start to crowd each other out and fight for nutrients, so they end up stabilizing. And in this case, we would say the carrying capacity for that little test tube is about 600, and I don't know what that is, maybe about 675 yeast cells. So density dependent factors. These are limiting factors that depend on how closely packed together the animals are or the organisms are. And often survival or reproduction lessens as populations become more dense. So some factors, well, let's get to that in a minute. These explain the logistic growth curve. Too many individuals too close together and resources run out faster. Disease can increase because now it's easier for germs to spread from one organism to another. There's more predation because now you have a nice big group of prey that you can. And so there's that image again. Density independent factors can occur regardless of density. So catastrophic weather events and volcanic eruptions, etc. These are considered density independent because it doesn't really matter how closely packed together these occurrences will happen either way. And here we see Parinacota volcano in Chile. If that were to erupt, these animals would likely die. Biotic potential is a term meaning the ability to produce offspring. And this is high for species producing lots of young. And here we see some little striped blenny fish eggs. How cute. Let's distinguish between R and K selected species. R selected species means they have many offspring, like those fish we just saw. They're fast growing. They require no parental care. And examples are not only fish, but frogs and insects. Contrast that with K selected species, which have few offspring, are slow growing, require parental care, and can be examples of mammals, birds, and humans. So we are K selected species. Where do these terms come from? R means intrinsic rate of population increase. Populations can potentially grow fast. K is a symbol for carrying capacity, which means that populations tend to stabilize near their carrying capacity. You don't really need to know that, just FYI. Another concept here is survivorship curves. And so what this means is how many of, or what percentage of a population will survive with each year as they get older. So from young to old, this is age on the horizontal. And what we find here is that our strategists have a survivorship curve that dips down quickly. And so in the first couple years, you would have likely death when young. And I say first couple years, it could even say first couple months for that matter. But these R strategists, they have so many babies. They could literally have thousands of babies. But most of them are going to die within the first few months of living. But the ones that do make it past middle age, they end up living or dying off at a steady rate from that point forward, at a slow and steady rate. This is different than case strategists, because with case strategists you are providing parental care, so your rate of infant mortality is much lower. And so most people who are born end up living at least till middle age, and then you get people kind of dropping off like flies as they're older. So in summary, with our strategists, most of the death happens to young, and with case strategists, most of the death happens to the older organisms. And there's some type 2 which are in the middle, like birds. Basically, for birds, each year a roughly equal portion of their population dies. Let me say that another way that might be more clear. If you start off with 1,000 birds and they were born in year 1, by year 2 you would have lost, say, 10%. Year 2, another 10%. Year 3, another 10%. So they drop off at an even rate. Whereas with our strategists, in the first year you might lose a third of yours, and in the next year you might lose a quarter, and then from there you start losing less and less each year. Okay. Let's take a look at population growth, some oscillations. We saw something like this today in our deer population. Some populations fluctuate continually above and below the carrying capacity, as with this mite. So mites tend to have, they tend to show these oscillations, kind of a boom-bust cycle. And here's another example that sometimes the oscillations dampen as population size settles toward the carrying capacity, as with this beetle. And this one we'll go into a little bit more, because here is where we see a caribou population or a reindeer population on St. Paul Island that rose too fast, and then it ended up depleting its resources and then crashed. And so as it's crashing, the resources now have an opportunity to grow back. And so what you could have following this crash would be another rise as the resources become available again, like what we saw in the lab. And we also see what we call predator-prey relationship. This is kind of classic, and some people argue how legit this model is. But basically, you have the lynx, which is hunting the snowshoe hare. And the lynx, what color is the lynx here? The lynx is the red one, and then the hare is the blue one. And so what we see here is that we see a drop first in the hare population, followed a little bit later or the next year by a drop in the lynx population. And we see that somewhat consistently. First the hare population drops, and then the lynx population drops. Because the hare being the prey means that without the hare, the lynx don't get the food they need, so their population begins to decline. And that's a summary. So we'll go over questions, and we'll do a little concept test on this in class.